Hi, this is a foreigner in the Philippines. Well, I'm just continuing with some bits of my life before I ever arrived at this paradise life that I now live. And of course, any good story, it never starts at the beginning and ends up where you are right now. You start wherever you want and you work backwards and forwards in time, flashbacks or whatever. But anyway, I thought I'd just tell you about what life was like when I was really small, and that was when the war was going on. And back in those days, because I am quite an elderly person, as everybody guesses, it was a difficult time in Manchester, because Manchester was an industrial town. It had a large factory, Dunlop's, and that was a target of the Germans, and they would send bombers. So I got used to, as a very young child, to the sound of the sirens, and the sirens would go and they would sound an air raid. So I got used to that sound. In fact, when my parents first had me, I actually was evacuated to another part of the country, and then I really don't know very much about that. Don't remember anything about the people, and my early recollections are of being in what I realise now were war years, but that back then I wasn't really aware. The children have this way of shutting out what they don't want to experience. Well, back then my family was like living in a war zone anyway. So inside there was war, and outside there was war, and it was no different. And inside we would listen to very, very heated arguments that would go on between my parents, and it was no great pleasure. So back in those days, my mother worked in the Dunlop factory at some point or other, and all of this is reconstructed from what she told me. Sometimes you put these things together as if they're memories. I'm not sure that they are. I remember lots of things. I remember sweets being on ration. You couldn't buy sweets. You couldn't buy candy. You couldn't buy chocolate. You couldn't buy meat. You couldn't buy clothes. Everything was on ration, and we used to have ration coupons. Well, my mother worked in the Dunlop factory, where I understand she used to spray barrage balloons, and barrage balloons always used to look like baby elephants to me, and they would be hoisted, they would be blown up and they'd be hoisted into the air, and they would be on long cables, and they would float high above the city, anchored by huge blocks of concrete which stayed around for years afterwards, and they were there to discourage low-flying aircraft. So they would, they're great, huge, thick cables would anchor these things into the ground like huge balloons. A little bit like the New York parades that you see when those great balloons are there. So that was what I used to see during the thing. All of the windows in our houses had brown tape on them, so that if they were blown in by explosions, they wouldn't actually just shatter. They'd be stuck together. And we had to have, the windows had to be blacked out, and then we would deal with the air raids, and the air raids would come over, and we'd hear planes droning over, and we'd hear explosions, we'd hear bombs going off, and I remember being told that my father, who was deaf, would be at home. He wasn't allowed to go into the army because of his hearing, and I think back in those days he had very severe bronchitis, and so I was at home with him as a baby. My sister was evacuated out into the country, but I was a baby and I was kept in at that time. But there's nothing wrong with my hearing, and apparently I would wake my father if I heard the sirens going for a bomb, an air raid. And if that were the case, he would, in his pyjamas, he would bundle me up in my pyjamas in a blanket, and we would rush out into the streets, and there would be a concrete air raid shelter, and inside the concrete air raid shelter would be our friends and neighbours, and we would all huddle in there and we'd listen to the bombs going off. And that would be a real mixed bag of experience, which I put together now in my mind, that there would be pregnant women, there would be women who had been left right at the beginning of the war, there would be others who had fathers or husbands like my father who remained back because they were not fit enough to go to war. And they would shelter each other. The older men would take children onto their knee that were not their own, and it was a family, neighbourly experience. And they would listen to the bombs going off, and some of them would be very close. And I can remember, one thing I can remember is playing as a kid in a house that I had known it when it wasn't bombed, and then it was bombed, and the kids went round to see it. Hey, it's been bombed, and Percy Street or something very close to where we lived, and we went round and we explored the ruined mess of this home, and there would be things there which would show just how instantaneous it is that the bomb goes off and it leaves some things right. There would be cups on the table that hadn't been touched, but there would be bricks and tumbled down window frames and all kinds of things that had just been there, overturned chairs, clothes that had just been left on the backs of chairs that had been turned over, and all kinds of what I realise now are very poignant things. And those homes would be damaged, and it was never ever mentioned what happened to those families, but if they had been in there, then there would have been no hope. So we would come out from the air raid shelter, which was quite close, within about 100 yards of our home, 20 Tamworth Street. I remember the address, 20 Tamworth Street. It's not even there anymore. It's been knocked down. They took it down because it was a slum, and I think they put new slums up instead. So 20 Tamworth Street, and we went down. Once the all clear, so you would get a siren that would go off, and that would say there's an air raid coming. Then you would hear the droning of aircraft, and then you would hear bombs falling. And the Germans had special bombs that had very small things, a little bit like this, something as big as this would be an incendiary bomb, and that incendiary bomb would also make fires, and the fires would light the way for bombers that were following behind, because there would be a blackout, so no lights were able to be shown, so that the bombers wouldn't be able to look down and know what they were bombing. That was the German. So what the Germans had are very clever. They used to drop a bomb that had a flute in it, looked a little bit like an organ in a church, and it would scream as it went down. Beep! And when it stopped, it would blow up. We would find our house was still there, and we were very lucky, but other houses around were bombed, and this was always a very graphic way of showing that life is a very tenuous thing. And in those days there was no central heating, so everything was by a fire, and there'd be a fire in every room. And when a 2-story, 3-story house was bombed, it would be bulldozed away, but on the side of the remaining terraced house would be all the fireplaces that were left hanging, and that was something that I grew up with. Well, my mother told me another side of that, of this experience, and she said that when it was women that were working in the factories then, and she said that the worst part of an air raid would be that when the air raid was over, a very cold, impersonal voice would come over the tannoy system, the loudspeaker system, and that voice would say that there has been damage in such and such a part of the city. And then the women would stand by their machines, whatever they were working at, and they would wait for the news. And this would be my mother too. And they would say, there's been major damage in Jeffrey Street, Smith Avenue, Wellington Place, Tamworth Street. And when this information was passed out in this cold, impersonal voice, women would faint.